right now, my body is feeling like I'm at an interfaith gathering where I'm about to announce that I no longer believe in God. Kevin asked me before if I was a sort of pessimist. And I said, I don't think it's a dualist business. I'm not a skeptic either. I am going to take the role of being something of a skeptic this afternoon. Having said that, mindfulness has been personally life-changing. So, mindfulness has been life-changing for many of my patients and my healthcare staff that I've taught this to. It was literally life-saving for a patient who emailed me the other day who said he stopped his tractor going off the edge of a cliff by staying mindful as it careered madly on a mud slope where his gears wouldn't engage. So I'm a huge fan of mindfulness, whatever mindfulness is. I also want to say that when I'm talking today that these views are my own. I'm not here representing MTI or SA Health or Oxford Mindfulness Centre. This is just contemplations of mine as I've watched the mindfulness field go in so many different directions over the past 16 years that I've been involved with it. And I do think the field is mature enough now for us to take a more tempered view of what's going on. I think it's time for us to be a little less evangelical and a little bit more measured, especially since there's such a cocktail of offerings out there that I don't know how the public would know even what they're receiving when they're told it's a mindfulness intervention. So, my views today, don't shoot me at the end. Try and bring a friendly curiosity to what I'm about to say, and we'll see how we go on. I've put this up not because you really need to see my CV, because I would like you to get a sense of what informs my views. I'm particularly interested in the Buddhist idea of dependent arising and causes and conditions and the way they inform our views and ways of being. So these are the had over the last 16 years that have informed mine. I trained in Glasgow, so that was a big formative experience. I moved to England and got leadership. I was in the inaugural chair of the International Integrity Network, which was looking at some of the ethical dilemmas that come up when you try and roll out mindfulness teacher training programs around the world. That was very informative. My time in Oxford was very interesting because there was such a focus on the science and the evidence base then. And I do work in organisations, including healthcare organisations, so I do have an understanding of the complexities when you try and take this work into a corporate or an organisational space. And I do practice in the insight meditation tradition, so it's important you know that. But at the end of the day, I'm just a Glaswegian Australian human being. And some of my bullshit views are because of my Glaswegian genes being upregulated. Because we're not really known for our tact and diplomacy as a nation. But there's nothing like a bit of refreshing honesty, and I think it's time for that. So, is mindfulness enough? So this was very intriguing when I was given this title, because I was thinking, wow, where's this coming from, this question? And actually, then it became clear to me, well, what is enough for what? Is mindfulness enough for what? And it depends on a range of things, but it particularly depends on the intention for which you're using mindfulness. And it also depends on how we measure if we've met that intention, so we can find out whether it was enough for whatever we were using it for. And we also have to take into account the type of mindfulness or our working definition of mindfulness, and as we've heard already in this conference, they are many and varied, and the context in which it's been offered in. So there's a number of influencing factors or confounding variables, or however you want to think about it. It has been said that the whole of this path, the Buddhist path, rests upon the head of the pin of intention. And it's something that I've found very helpful now when I am teaching people mindfulness, to be very clear about what my intention is, so that they're clear about how they're applying it and why, and how they might work out, whether it's useful for them. And I found this paper particularly helpful. I don't know how many of you have seen this paper by Shauna Shapiro and her colleagues. She wrote it back in 2006, which is quite a long time now. So often people have heard the discussion about how we pay attention in mindfulness, what the quality of that attention is, and what the attitude is that we're bringing, which is often one of friendly interest or openness or non-judgmental acceptance. These are the terms we use. Whether that's exactly what the Buddha meant is something that Eric was illuminating very nicely for us before lunch. But what to me clarified things most of all was this notion of intention. When we sit down to practice, or when we put together a mindfulness course, what is our intention for our participants or for ourselves? And of course, these things are constantly interacting with one another. They're changing over time. They're certainly changing with the context. So I'm going to cover the context and the intentions in three areas. The first area is in physical and mental health care settings, which is the area I know most about, where the intention is clearly about reducing symptoms, as opposed to general suffering or liberation or dukkha, whatever you want to call it. It's about reducing the likelihood of those symptoms coming back, and it has an intention to increase function and well-being. When we move to mindfulness offerings, including apps, in the community or the workplace, this is where I think it gets a lot messier. I think the intentions become less clear. They can be unclear to the people coming to the courses or using the apps. They can be unclear for the people who are funding these things. The people that fund it may want a certain outcome. The teacher delivering it may have another idea in mind, and the people rocking up to the course may have another intention again. And it's also because the intentions are so varied, as it says there. Everything from reducing stress to increasing self-compassion, being more productive in the workplace because you're better able to pay attention, you're less distracted, you're more resilient, you're more productive, there's less staff turnover, less sick leave. Suddenly the intentions have become many and varied and quite disparate. And then the last thing I'm just going to touch on, I'm certainly not qualified to speak in this in any expert way, apart from my own experience of being a meditator for a long time, but is to look at mindfulness in the Dharma setting as part of the Eightfold Path, where the intention is clearly about something else. It's about releasing ourselves from the causes and conditions that maintain or cause suffering and help us attain enlightenment. I don't know of a good outcome measure for enlightenment. There may be one that's been developed somewhere, but I haven't come across it yet. So let's just start quickly with mindfulness programs in healthcare settings and where it began. And some people would argue about this, but the kind of lineage that I'm part of, which is the mindfulness-based programs, then it started clearly with John Kabat-Zinn in the US, who set up the mindfulness-based stress reduction course, with the intention of helping people with chronic pain and physical conditions that were no longer amenable to modern medicine's interventions, to reduce the resulting stress, anxiety, and depression that followed on. When it says here that it was an 8-week program that taught yoga and meditation, then right away you've introduced a confounding variable. Because we don't just have mindfulness, we've also got yoga, we've got the group effect, we've got the fact that we've got a very charismatic person like John leading it. So you've already got a whole range of things in there that are attributed to the mindfulness part. It's John. That's his book. This is his somewhat controversial definition, depending on who you talk to. But he is really talking about paying attention. He was assisting people to learn how to be here in the present moment in a more engaged way with a particular attitude. What he would add now, and probably always intended, was that it was in the service of something. It was in the service of reducing your reactivity to having chronic pain, or not being able to walk anymore, or not being able to work anymore because of your physical state. And recent times he'll talk about also that it's in the service of wisdom and compassion. So he's got a wider intention for the world. So I have looked at a couple of other definitions, and the one I like here is Christina Feldman's definition, which is actually quoted in the MBCT manual. And she talks about this quality, and this comes up a lot in the discussion about mindfulness versus self-compassion, as if, again, there's another dualism going on. But it's not a neutral or a blank or a cold, clinical form of attention. It's imbued with a certain warmth, compassion, and interest. And in the light of this engaged attention, we can discover things. We can discover that we understand things, and then our reactivity in terms of hate or fear can drop away. And I'm going to outline why this is so relevant to our current understanding of why people get recurrent depression shortly. So let's just have a look at this. You've seen this slide already. I think Craig put it up. But what has also been added in here is the dotted line, which shows how clearly the research publications in peer-reviewed journals are also equally met and matched by the amount of coverage in the media. This has captured media attention like no other intervention has ever captured the media's attention. And I'll talk about some of the issues that arise as a result of that a bit later on. But it also gave rise to the Mindfulness Research Monthly, and now there's a mindfulness journal, so if people don't know about this, they might be interested. A lot of the research and commentary is published in there. And it has spread hugely in the UK, where I've spent a lot of time, not just last year on sabbatical, but it began with their studies, and then they published a manual. That moved it into the NICE guidelines, which is the National Institute for Clinical Excellence guidelines in the UK, which guides the NHS in what programmes they commission to have available to the public, which of course then meant that they had to quickly start training teachers, which started for the first time in Bangor. More research was done on whether you could use it in people with suicidal depression. In Oxford, Exeter took up further work on comparing it to antidepressants, and it spread throughout the NHS through a scheme called Improved Access to Psychological Therapies, and in schools, where it is now the subject of a very large multi-million-dollar project, looking at what happens if you implement it in schools and then follow up the kids over several years to see whether it has an impact, not just in their immediate well-being, but in reducing the vulnerability to depression and anxiety, which is increasingly having an age of onset that's younger and younger. What has been really helpful for the field was when, at least in this context of the MBPs, they decided to try and define the offering a bit more clearly. What is a mindfulness-based program? Not just the generic mindfulness that's out there or mindfulness within a Buddhist context, but the mindfulness-based programs that are offered generally in healthcare settings, but also in community settings in terms of MBSR. What defines it so we can compare like with like when we do research or we talk about different interventions? This is a really useful paper. If people haven't seen it, I would thoroughly recommend it. They look at the warp. So this is a kind of main frame, if you like, of the tapestry, the main weave of it, and how mindfulness-based programs rely on theories and evidence from research and cognitive psychology and the like that really inform the different interventions that are being offered, but not just from science and medicine, psychology and education, but also from the contemplative tradition. So it's a real marriage of East and West, if you like. That's another dualism, but it was really a way of being a very rounded out kind of offering, underpinned by a model of human experience which tries to address the causes of human distress with pathways, mindfulness pathways, so very clear application of mindfulness, where there's a new relationship that one has with present moment experience, but is also developing other wholesome qualities: insight, compassion, wisdom, equanimity, self-regulation. But this last one is so important because it's saying this is a sustained, intensive training in an experiential, inquiry-based learning process with a teacher who's going to be able to engage in that dialogue with you. Now, this does separate it out from apps, for example, because you're not in relationship with a teacher who can help you deal with things when things go wrong. My son, the other day, and I'm about to drop the F-bomb, so just cover your ears if you don't like that word, but if you've got teenagers, you can't avoid it, especially if they're boys, teenage boys. And he was talking to me about mindfulness. I was telling him about this talk, and I said, what do you reckon, Jamie, about this notion of mindfulness and bliss and well-being? And he said, you know, Mum, mindfulness can be as confronting as fuck. I said, okay, go on. And he said, then you confront those confronting feelings. And that's what mindfulness is about. You sit with it, you watch it coming and going, and then you kind of get to know stuff about yourself. You get to know stuff about yourself. That's what mindfulness is. It's like, I bow. Deep bow. Would you like to give this talk in Melbourne, Sasha? So this is important. There has to be a relationship with a wise person that can help you make sense of your experience, because sometimes it will not be blissy, it will be as confronting as fuck, and you will not know what's going on and how to manage it. Anyone else had that experience in their meditation practice? And then the weft is where you adapt this basic 8-week program, or this kind of, maybe not 8 weeks, but this very thorough program with these ingredients to the specific context and population that you want to work with. So that's where there may be variations on emphasis, structure, length, and delivery, but it still has to have all those things on the on the left-hand side. So if I just talk a bit about the weft adaptations of MBSR for the management of depression, which resulted in the creation of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, MBCT. And I don't know whether the Dalai Lama actually said that. He often gets many things attributed to him, but I like it. So somebody wise said it anyway. It might not have been him. But Mark Williams did say this. So he's a professor, he's now retired, was a professor of cognitive psychology at Oxford, established the Oxford Mindfulness Centre, and he made this point last year in a summer school, that Buddhist psychology is the most detailed description of the mind and psyche ever written. The science of psychology is only 140 years old. That was a really nice perspective. There was a deep wisdom to be drawn on. We discover things again in cognitive psychology research that the Buddha had described, 2,500 years ago. So this, if I just give you one model of depression, and there are many models of depression. When Craig said, I don't know if Craig's here, when Craig said that depression could be understood as a disorder of attention, well, that's just one leg of the elephant of depression, if you like, the disorder of attention. There are many ways that you can understand depression. Another one is a cognitive model, which I'm going to show you. And of course, there's a biological model of depression, and there's a psychosocial model of depression, there's an interpersonal model of depression, there's a psychodynamic model of depression. There's no one model of depression. In fact, a good psychiatrist will have some understanding of a range of them to try and understand which one seems to be the most relevant contributor in the individual you have sitting in front of you, and in the individuals who are going to come and do your mindfulness course. So I'll just go through this really quickly, but basically this discrepancy monitoring is this inbuilt capacity in our brains to make sure that if we're tired, we sleep, if we're hungry, we eat, if we're thirsty, we drink. It's a way of making sure that our body's in a state of comfortable homeostasis, which is a good place to operate from. But it also involves a vigilance to make sure that the internal and external environment is kind of in harmony. And if people have been depressed before, and I used to see this all the time in my clinical practice and still do, that if they've been depressed before and they have some early warning signs of depression, then they will go often into a state of anxious rumination. Oh my God, it's coming back. Oh no, I can't bear this again. It wiped out 3 months of my life. It was terrible for everyone. I lost my job. All of that starts up, along with a lot of body sort of agitation. So that's that hypervigilance. And it seemed to me, even before I learned about MBCT, that this was really a slippery slope back into relapse because of the agitation being brought up by early warning signs. which if you just stayed grounded and breathed would sometimes pass and not take hold. But when people have been depressed before, then their information processing changes and they're much more what we call cognitively reactive. So people are more likely to put a negative view or take a negative view on things, or only see the negative in something when they've been depressed before, not because they want to, not because they're trying to, not because they're choosing to, but because that's what happens phenomenologically when you've had depression. The way you process your environment changes and there's more negativity around. And of course, people then start to think their way out of this. They try and use their prefrontal cortex to think their way out of this problem of depression, which just means that people get more and more engaged in rumination, which there is a lot of research to show just makes it more likely you'll be unhappy, less able to effectively problem solve, and more likely to relapse. And because all of this is quite unpleasant, then there's a real desire to try and avoid it all. Of course, completely understandable. Suppressing thoughts, wanting to go and retreat and have a nice blissful experience that will make everything go away. Good luck with that. All you're likely to do is sit more clearly with everything that's going on in your mind. But it's also where we want to soothe ourselves and where we will engage in maladaptive kind of coping or soothing, which in Glasgow takes the form of copious amount of alcohol. But also a lot of singing, dancing and laughing, which is quite a good antidepressant, fortunately. So having taken all of that research, they then did the weft of MBSR and put things into each of the 8 weeks that were specifically using mindfulness to target the processes that make it more likely for people to relapse. Things like just noticing that you're on autopilot and you're not present and you've been totally preoccupied and thinking about that meeting last week that didn't go very well all the way through your weekend when you're meant to be resting, restoring, relaxing and being with your family and your friends. So knowing that you're on autopilot, knowing what the danger of it is, starting to introduce practices that will bring you more back into a grounded, present moment way of paying attention. Lots of psychoeducation about what happens when you get caught up in thinking. And of course, because by the end of the second week or at the start of week 3, people have spent 2 weeks doing the body scan, which is often quite unpleasant, boring, agitating, then you've already had 2 good weeks of solid practice in non-reactivity, which is great because cognitive reactivity is one of the things that will bring on more depression. Very targeted. I could go on. It's a very deep and nuanced program, so I can't go through it all, but I just want to talk about how by session 4, people are obviously talking about the degree of aversion they have to their mindfulness practice. Not a great selling point. It's not enjoyable. This is hectic as fuck, as Jane would say. But again, they're learning how to be curious about it and bring some friendliness to it and have another way of sitting with difficulty, which is very much elaborated on with the opening to the difficult practice in week 5, where people are not just learning to be non-reactive, but they're learning to move in closer to the difficulty, actually get to know it a bit and see what it's made up of. And this insight is so useful in helping people see what's really there and having new ways to work with it through the body, working with it in the body, not through more thinking. Getting much more awareness of mind states and the kind of mind states that arise in depression and anxiety, and then the behaviours that go along with them, like withdrawing and shutting down and avoiding or drinking or smoking or eating too much chocolate or whatever your thing is. And starting to put together a kind of wise plan for life that may be likely to reduce falling back into depression and staying well. It's beautiful, actually. Those men that wrote that, put that together, are geniuses because they took the knowledge and they applied it using mindfulness in such a lovely, accessible way. And of course, their question was, would people who are been depressed before engage with something like this? Because when you're well, you just want to forget all about it. But they did. And the people that come to our clinic are still symptomatic. Would they come to an 8-week course and do 40 minutes of meditation a day? Well, they do. They do. because they can sense that maybe this makes sense, and often because they're desperate and maybe they just trust me or my fellow teachers. But somehow there's something about it that makes sense, and they give it a go. Then after a couple of weeks, they're kind of in, and the dropout rate is very low. I'm going to do a little bit of a digression here. I know we'll talk about this later on in the panel. But one of the things that's gotten confusing, a little bit confusing for me in the mindfulness world, is the mindful self-compassion explosion that's also happening, or the compassion cultivation or compassion practices. I'm going to say a bit about why they're not taught explicitly in MBCT, and then I'm going to talk a bit about what I'm kind of making of it, but I'm still confused about it. Within the mindfulness world, not completely confused about it. But it's not taught, they're not taught explicitly in MBCT for the reasons that you can see there on the slide. The teacher hopefully is embodying or modelling an attitude towards experience that the participants discuss in inquiry, that they can then learn to take to themselves within their own experience. If I go, interesting, when you were bored during the body scan, or that must have been hard for you to sit through that whole body scan, well done you for hanging in there, that's really courageous, then hopefully that way of being with it is a way that they can take into their practice when they're practicing at home by themselves when you're not there. The attitude in mindfulness practices is already imbued with warmth and compassion, as Christina's definition shows, and anyway the self-compassion scores still go up without us teaching it explicitly. This is from our data set, highly significant improvements or increases in self-compassion without us teaching any compassion practices. The other reason we don't teach it is because people with a lot of harsh self-criticism within depression will see this as another failure if they can't generate a sense of loving kindness that they're being invited to in the practice. And they'll start ruminating about that potentially. Or people even say, frequently in our class, when we talk about just breathing some care into something in the morning, they say, I don't even know what you mean by that. And of course, there's the work by Paul Gilbert and Germer and Neff too, that soothing and kindness can activate the threat systems of people who have got an early abuse and trauma history. What I would add to this conversation is that I think there's quite a lot of confusion and conflation between the terms compassion, loving kindness, empathy, sympathetic, appreciative joy. Things that are understood very clearly or defined very clearly within the Brahma Viharas, within a Buddhist context, are now kind of smooshed together in the non-Buddhist setting. These terms are used interchangeably. Mindfulness, as I've understood it, is about being with whatever's here in the present moment and being interested in that, whereas the loving kindness, compassion practices are clearly generating something that's not there to make it be there, which is great. It's fine. It's very useful. There's a good evidence base or growing evidence base for it. But it's different from mindfulness. So that's just a little bit confusing maybe. It confuses me. It may confuse the participants. Some cultures and groups will not take to self-compassion very easily. Like, you have to be really thoughtful about how you introduce it. Just don't try introducing self-compassion practices on a Saturday night in Glasgow, for example, because somebody might punch you. It's not a culture that has worked with compassion explicitly. It's a culture that works with resilience, getting on with things, drinking, laughing, singing, and being compassionate in terms of the way community connects with one another, or the fact that you'll help out your neighbour if their car's broken down. But it's not going in and going, I really won't, I'm being silly. Not that that's what self-compassion is all about, but you just got to be so careful about how you introduce this stuff. But I'm sure Katrina will have much more intelligent things to say about this than I do. I'm not going to go into this because of the time, and I lost a bit of time because of all of the volume stuff at the start. But just to say that within the neuroscientific literature, people are starting to examine what is the difference between empathy and compassion. What does that look like in the brain? Is there such a thing really as compassion fatigue, or even that lovely term idiot compassion, which has been an enormously helpful term that came from one of the Tibetan lineages? is now being re-described as empathic distress, and there's different parts of the brain that light up, but I'm running out of time, so I'm going to move on. So coming back to that question, is mindfulness enough? How do we know? Well, we have to try and measure it, knowing that our instruments are clumsy and clunky and not nuanced enough. But if I just quickly, and I don't need to say too much for this because Craig's already outlined some of this already, but with the MBCT, it is efficacious for people with recurrent depression, and especially if they have still quite pronounced residual symptoms, which is rather marvellous, because usually the more episodes somebody has of any condition and the more residual symptoms they have, usually the harder it is to treat. So isn't it rather wonderful that MBCT seems to be particularly efficacious in this group? The meta-analyses, where you gather a whole lot of studies together and see whether the themes are coming through in some kind of consistent fashion, demonstrate, and there's a number of meta-analyses now, I've just put up a couple of the more recent ones, showing that yes, there's a good solid evidence base that it can affect depression and anxiety for the better, reduce stress, improve quality of life, and as an adjunct to certain physical conditions. Not all of them, not panacea. Just say something really quickly about the slide where they tried to look at what are the mediating factors that seem to be particularly making a difference in mindfulness, both MBSR and MBCT, in terms of improving mental health and well-being. Well, some of the things that we might think weren't coming through with the strongest evidence. Self-compassion at the moment, they feel, has got very preliminary and insufficient evidence to say it's a strong mediator, whereas being able to reduce your reactivity and not ruminate so much because you've really engaged in quite a sustained, intensive training to work with the focus of your attention does make a difference, which theoretically makes complete sense. I just think when we offer new modifications of mindfulness, we want to make sure that it is actually going to target the processes and mind states that are either causing or maintaining the particular form of suffering that you see. I'm not going to go into this in detail again because there isn't time, but just to say there's an awful lot of hype about the neuroscience. And this paper is a rather marvellous paper. I found it very confronting when I first read it. I think Nicholas is presenting tomorrow. But it really was very highly critical of the research evidence on mindfulness. That this lovely presentation that Craig gave this morning, if Nicholas was in the audience, I don't think Nicholas is here, I'm going to talk for him, but I suspect he might have a slightly different take, because their paper concluded this. It was very rigorous research. Statistical significance on outcome measures is often thought to be the same thing as clinical or practical significance, but sometimes it's not. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. That when you overhype and overuse mindfulness in certain clinical settings, one of the problems is you have an opportunity cost. That time and money is wasted on an ineffective therapy. I cannot tell you how many patients are referred to our clinic for MBCT where that is not the evidence-based treatment of choice for the condition that they've got. The definition of the MBI, mindfulness-based intervention, or MBP, that we're using is not often made clear enough. And we don't even know if people are completely adhering to the model. But they do need to be adhering to the model so we can measure like with like. And they do conclude that neuroscience findings need to be reported with all due modesty. I think that's a very veiled way of saying stop overselling the neuroscience. There's a lot we don't understand yet. So this is ethically important to consider. And somebody said to me the other day about this talk, it was, can mindfulness be taken out of the ethical framework of Buddhism from which it was embedded? And one of the things that concerns me and concerned the International Integrity Network a lot was that we pick up bits and pieces of the research to sell our program to pay our mortgage, which is an understandable pressure, when there might not be a really good evidence base for the particular intervention we're offering. And we're often saying that the evidence base for the 8-week courses is the evidence base for the whole of mindfulness. That just cannot be true. Be really clear, folks, that the evidence base is often about an 8-week structured program with 40 minutes of meditation practice every day. That might not be the same as a little sprinkling of mindfulness like fairy dust over whatever condition you're working with. And this is something I talk to clinicians about a lot. What's your intention when you bring mindfulness into your therapeutic practice? Because lots of people are adding it like a sprinkle of fairy dust to their usual therapy. And I don't know why, actually. Because it's fashionable, maybe. But we have to ask, we might not even want to engage with mindfulness at all as clinicians, and that's okay. Or you might want to be a mindful clinician, but not teach it to your clients. And there's evidence that shows, at least in one study, that you'll get better outcomes if you're mindful. Well, no surprises there. If you're mindful and present, that's probably a good idea if you're a clinician. Do you want to practice a kind of mindfulness enhanced therapy, like DBT or ACT, where mindfulness is a smaller part, taught much more lightly and carefully because of some of the conditions they're working with, like complex trauma? Or do you want to train in, and it's quite a business training, to become an MBP teacher in some of the evidence-based treatments like MBCT, MBSR, MBRP, MICBT, MBCP. You're probably bewildered what are even all those things, but they all have a theoretical rationale and an evidence base. So do it, with awareness. Just something about this notion of evidence base, which has become some kind of amazing kind of term all by itself, as if it's a magical thing. If it's got an evidence base, by definition, marvellous. Evidence-based practice was meant to be an integration of your best evidence or information from current research, your experienced clinical judgment, the timing of it, the appropriateness of it, and whether your patient actually wants to engage in it. You can't prescribe MBCT to someone who doesn't want it. That's really important. Sometimes it's come to mean the limited picture we get from only considering a randomized controlled trial. If we look at these two randomized controlled trials, which were showing, the early work showed that MBCT was effective at reducing relapse. So MBCT plus treatment as usual, you can see those people had much lower relapse rates than people who had treatment as usual. But what about the 31 to 37% of people who were still relapsing? What about them? Maybe your cognitive model, your mindfulness intervention is not what they need. And what happens after the 1-year follow-up of an RCT? I can tell you what happens because we have a clinic where people come back years afterwards and people relapse. This stuff wears off sometimes, not for everyone. And sometimes people need medication too. And that's skillful action. And I hope then I'm engaging in skillful livelihood. I'm going to speed up now and start talking very fast in a very loud Glaswegian accent, which means you will understand nothing of what I'm about to say. So there are side effects, which we're going to talk about later in our panel, so I won't go into them all now. There are issues when you start taking it into the community. I've taught in Westminster. It was amazing and also sobering, because politicians, guess what, are human beings too, and they were coming for themselves. It doesn't necessarily translate into widespread, amazing policy shift. Sad but true. This comment is quite confronting. And this is a risk sometimes if you take it into corporate settings. People might just feel better about firing employees or something, I don't know. There is such a lot of negative hype around mindfulness. People trying to get rid of nasty, unpleasant thoughts and feelings. Build bigger brains. And then feel disappointed. I haven't got what I paid for. It can be as confronting as that. So is this a buyer beware scenario, like any product in the marketplace? And look at some of the things that arise around it for us as mindfulness teachers. Competition with that other mindfulness teacher down the road. My mindfulness is better than your mindfulness. I'm a much better, more embodied teacher than you are. Not very embodied. So look at the media following. We've had this. Why are they always blonde white women, dressed all in white? This time she hasn't got her hands up there, but usually they do. Well, where's the diversity and inclusion in that? But it's a very positive message, and she looks very happy and blissed out. I just wouldn't want her to be my surgeon, though. There's good old Michael Mosley. But this is what's starting to come through in the media. Good news in the media is becoming old news. Now it's all the bad news, how nasty and problematic mindfulness can be. So this person meditating, the shadow side. Let me go really fast now because I know that I'm holding up from transition into the next bit. So this has been discussed a bit about right mindfulness and how it needs self-restraint, wholesome mental states and ethical behaviours. That applies to us too as we sell our products. We need accurate understanding and good judgment, as Eric was highlighting in his talk. We need to remember that within the Dharma, within the Eightfold Path, it's just one element. Is mindfulness enough? Well, it was just one element of the Eightfold Path. Pretty important one. But there's 7 other ones too. And in the Dharma, in the intensive retreat setting, that's where most of the side effects have been reported. Most of the adverse events have been reported on intensive meditation retreats. Progress or pathology? A very interesting debate. People will sometimes become manic or psychotic. Insight, quite aside from that, brings pain and change for all of us. And you know what the monks do with the unwell members? They send them to the likes of me. They don't send them to do particular practices. So, let's keep things in perspective. The mindfulness in the meditation world, I'm near the end now, has a shadow side that I think we need to grasp. I think the field is ready to grasp this. I think it's time to maybe burst the bliss bubble a little bit. Because we have an overemphasis on science in the evidence space. We have the overselling of our product and commodification. We have very swiftly trained mindfulness teachers who don't have their own meditation practice. It's used as a panacea and a band-aid in toxic workplaces, which is not helpful. There's lack of diversity and inclusion. There's a glossing over of side effects. So is mindfulness enough? Depends on all of those things. It's complicated.